Okay, let's talk about temperaments. This is, a lot of research in terms of identifying different qualities of temperament, particularly in children. And these are these inherited personality traits that are presumably present at birth that, we can use to identify different people from infancy on up. Okay, so the idea is that these are genetically based. They are pervasive in that they affect how and what we do in many different ways. Three fundamental temperaments we'll talk about: activity level, sociability, and emotionality. So activity level is kind of like your, how essentially how active you are. Do you do a lot of different activities, exercise a lot, walk a lot, dance a lot, whatever. Your activity level is maybe how busy you are, moving from place to place. Okay? People who have a low activity level, perhaps they may be more sedentary, more, more laid back in terms of their activities. Maybe prefer sit like quiet, peaceful activities and not too much jumping around. The sociability temperament is your preference for being with others. There are going to be people who are, who prefer to be with other people, and there are others who kind of prefer to be by themselves most of the time. Finally, emotionality is how easily you are to be emotionally aroused. Now, you should start seeing some familiarity here. There is some overlap here with the big five characteristics, and we'll talk about that in a second. We think about emotionality. Well, we talked about that. We talked about that as the neuroticism trait in the big five theory. Sociability sounds a lot like extroversion, although maybe extroversion may be a combination of sociability and activity level. Who knows? So again, you're seeing just another example of overlap between the particular theories. Okay. Some other areas of interest when it comes to studying temperaments are the approach and avoidance, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The approach system, and there's behavioral approach, and then there's a behavioral inhibition system, and we'll probably talk about that when we get to the next chapter. But with the approach and avoidance, it's kind of like there are things that we want to move forward toward, like reward, moving toward things that we like, moving toward goals that we have. And there's also avoidance, where we want to avoid getting punished, where we want to avoid any pain. So we back away from things that we see as threatening. And, maybe there are people who are kind of more on the approach side, and there are others who are more on the avoidance side in terms of how we deal with the people and environment around us. Effortful control is another aspect of temperament. Is kind of like your restraint. How you can control your. Sometimes you need to be able to control your behavior in a particular way. You want to do something, but you kind of have to hold yourself back, and they're kind of like a restraint. Conscientiousness could be considered very strongly related to effortful control. With your conscientious, you make sure you get everything done. You may want to go and have fun, but you want to make sure you get everything done first. So you kind of have to control that. Okay. So as far as the traits that we inherit, there seems to be a good deal of evidence that we do inherit a great number of traits. That heritability plays a big role. Certainly not the only role, but heritability does play a big role for many different traits. And this is true for all of the big five personality traits that we've talked about before. As I said before, there's plenty of overlap between the temperaments, such that neuroticism and emotionality are pretty much the same thing, strong correlation. Extroversion and activity extroversion and sociability, there's kind of a weak correlation with activity, a somewhat strong correlation with sociability. Agreeableness also kind of touches on sociability. Openness touches on intelligence, conscientiousness, negatively correlated with impulsivity, which would make a lot of sense. Okay. Now, the field of molecular genetics, really studying what is going on within the human genome. The genome is kind of like your genetic blueprint as a human being. And the genetic blueprint really, for most of the human genome, is identical from person to person. We have the same species, so much of the human genome is identical. But there are some differences that arise that essentially allow for individual differences, not just in appearance but in personality. Okay, and the molecular genetics has been looked at to look for perhaps susceptibility for different kinds of diseases like breast cancer, but there's also been research done to look for specific areas that may be related to personality, such as novelty seeking or pursuit of rewards. Again, pursuit of rewards, that's the approach system I was talking about before. Impulse versus constraint. So the impulsivity is kind of like the opposite of that effortful control. But nevertheless, there's a limit to what we can do. Currently, we can't necessarily point to a specific gene for this or for that kind of characteristic. It's a very as we said before, a complex human organism, so there's a lot of complexity in terms of trying to find out, to limit it to say it's one specific gene that is responsible for this kind of complex human behavior is probably a little bit naive. But there's nevertheless, you can find out a lot about what may be going on within the human genome. Okay, so for example, talking about those differences at different locations across our DNA, you have certain alleles where there might be a difference, and for one person or another. That difference is called a polymorphism. So where one person can have it one way, another person can have it another way. And the fact that if you have two different people with two different alleles at that particular site, then we're talking about, they would say that they have different genotypes. So in other words, person A and person B, their genetic structure at that particular location along the DNA strand is that particular location. There is a difference between person 1 and person 2. So that represents different genotypes. And if you want to extend further, the phenotype is where you would actually observe an observable difference between person A and person B, perhaps based on that different genotype. So again, these are so basically within our DNA structure, this essentially, there's a lot more to be revealed about how it relates to our personality, but research goes on. Okay. Realize genetics is not the only thing, of course, that environmental influences do play a big role in determining our personality and our behavior. Okay. And perhaps it may even be underestimated, Sometimes in terms of estimating, determining a genetic effect, maybe that correlation is kind of also including some aspects of environmental effects kind of combined on one particular characteristic. Okay. So again, the environment and genetic effects can have a shared influence. Sometimes they could be influencing each other in various ways. You can have, for example, a situation where an environmental factor can essentially activate or turn on a particular gene, and where if you do not have that, if we're not exposed to that particular environment, then that gene would not be activated. That gene would not be. Again, we talk about the diathesis stress model. Essentially, suggests where a person could be susceptible to developing a mental illness if there are situational, environmental stressors that could potentially bring it on. So, in other words, you could have, for example, a gene for a particular characteristic that could be turned on based or turned off based on some kind of environmental factor. Furthermore, that essentially turned on gene could then be passed on to the next generation. So again, kind of a growing gray area between environment and genetics. They are related. So if we're talking about the effect of genetics on who you are, so if we're talking about like biological parents and children, well, yeah, children are definitely related to their biological parents. I'm sure all of you might think about ways in which you are similar to your mom or your dad, both physically as well as personality-wise. Well, your parents are also raising you in the environment that they are comfortable in. So, for example, let's say you have parents who are very, very sociable. Okay? Well, like in all likelihood, that child is going to be exposed to lots and lots of different people, inside and outside of the house. So that child might become more sociable because that is the environment they are raised in, not just because their parents happen to be sociable as well. Furthermore, people seek out those environments that allow their predispositions, that may be genetic, to flourish. So the sociable child is going to choose activities, choose places to go, things to do that allow her to be with a lot of other people and to be able to socialize with them. Finally, your genetic dispositions evoke different responses from others. People who are very sociable and who have been sociable for a long time and have a lot of experience dealing with other people, they not only have the genetic predisposition, they also have the experience of dealing, of interacting, having positive interactions with other people. So if you were a stranger and you met this person would behave in a friendly manner and would make you more comfortable and perhaps make you behave more sociably toward her. So this person here with the genetic predisposition to be sociable, as well as all of that experience being sociable, might now evoke sociable responses from strangers that she would meet. Perhaps even people who would not normally be sociable might be sociable around her. We affect other people as well as other people affecting us. Now, an interesting point here is the influence of non-shared environmental influences. And this is very important. A lot of people assume that if you are identical twins, you were raised together, dress in the same clothes, everything like that, spend a lot of time together, well then you are essentially sharing the same environment, same parents, same dinner schedule, whatever. Well, it turns out that there's a lot that is non-shared. In fact, it is basically impossible to have two separate individuals have the identical environment. So are their experiences really identical? They are not going to be identical. Even identical twins, they may have different friends, different social networks. There's going to be a lot of similarity for sure, but it's not going to be the same thing. Their experiences are necessarily going to be different. And those non-shared environmental influences may be actually very, very important in terms of shaping personality. So if you're seeing, identical twins, okay, a lot of their differences might be due to the environmental influences that they do not share with one another. Realize also that two individuals can essentially be experiencing the same environmental circumstance, but be perceiving it in different ways. So in a sense, you're experiencing two different environments then. Okay. All right. So anyway, what we now want to move on to looking at